What do you see when you look at this? Or this? Or even this? For many, these examples of gameplay footage don't amount to much, just pixels and polygons smashed together to make a semi-cohesive image. Some who see them favorably might garner nostalgia from the sprite art of the third generation of consoles or the compromised polygons of the fifth. Others may look at them unfavorably and simply see them as a necessary step toward better visuals and game design that would come in later generations. But there is a third group out there that I suspect had a different reaction to this imagery. A reaction that I think was once very common in the gaming landscape, and one that, perhaps, has been diminished over time. That group looks at these games, and many that even came later, and sees a template for the imagination. A key to a grander vision nestled in the back of the mind, expanding upon the experience presented on screen to make a cornucopia of imagery that brings the world to life. That's not to say this doesn't happen in modern gaming. Certainly, indie spaces especially can still have this effect. But the closer we've gotten to realistic graphical fidelity, I think the less we've had this feeling. And that's not a bad thing. I love a great looking game, but there is, I think, a byproduct of this being the norm for the last decade that has come to irk me, and that's when there's an insistence that an old game needs a remake. Now, I won't stand here and talk about if gameplay should or shouldn't be expanded upon or fixed, nor will I mention bugs. That's not really the exploration I mean to have here today, and I don't think either topic is one I feel falls into my wheelhouse to speak on. However, I will point you to Super Eyepatchwolf's side channel video called This Game Needs a Remake for my general feelings on that subject. I don't personally think good game design goes out of style. I just think sensibilities change, and that is not the same as outdated. Which is why I have such a dislike for remakes that rewrite entire gameplay structures for, quote, modern sensibilities, because more often than not that is corporate talk and not a new and interesting twist made by creatives. But regardless of that, for me, this is more a conversation about the idea that if a game doesn't have an absolutely top-tier ray trace 60 frames per second 4K experience, it needs to be improved upon. And while I recognize that this isn't how a lot of folks think about remakes, it is how the corporate overlords of the industry thinks about them. Well, that and also they don't particularly like the used game or retro gaming industry and want to monetize nostalgia, but I digress. I think this thought process got popular enough in the 7th generation of consoles that it overtook a lot of conversations about any game older than 10 years. And to me, the question is, do these games need remakes, really? Now, I'm not going to pretend that I don't love the occasional remaster or remake. As a great example, I've been on record as saying that the Shadow of the Colossus remake is easily the best version of the game. But that does come with a caveat. Way back in the day when I played the original version, I couldn't help but feel that this was a PS3 game trapped in the body of a PS2 disc, so the level up in imagery felt like a natural conclusion to that experience. Also, congratulations on your transition, girl!
Gender is a made-up social construct. I am not that. I don't fit into your little boxes, okay? I am something beyond. Something that doesn't exist yet. Something that you can never understand. And then like 4 months later...
But that example is a rarity to me, and I often feel the search for graphical fidelity takes away from design. It's hard to remove Oblivion, for example, from the overexposed color of the Xbox 360 and get the same effect. And equally, it's difficult to replicate the ethereal, almost minimalist, man-made plastic beauty of the original Halo by adding more. All of this comes down to taste, obviously, but I think the reason both of these previous entries, and perhaps even Shadow of the Colossus, come to mind is I never looked at these games and expected literal interpretations of the environment they were creating. Even as late as last generation, the imagination was still a critical part of my gaming experience, and these entries were no different. There's an incredible video by Rosenkreutz called The Elder Scrolls and the World Beyond Play, and I highly recommend this video. It's one of my favorites. And in that video, they talk about something I never had words for and yet intrinsically understood. The concept of implied spaces. When you walk into the Imperial City in Oblivion, you're free to interact directly with the shops and citizens there. But somewhere in the back of your mind, you recognize that this isn't actually what the Imperial City looks like. It's a diorama of it, a physical space for the player to walk through that presents a gameplay experience, but you inherently know that this capital of the entire empire that goes far beyond the game space you have in Oblivion is thousands upon thousands of times bigger than the space you exist within. In fact, all you have to do to understand that is to look at the juxtaposition between it and Daggerfall, which is actually the size of its in-world counterpart. But with that choice comes the drawback of procedural generation and fast travel systems to make it manageable, a choice the series never went back to in favor of implied space within a unique and carefully built world map. When I'm walking through Morrowind or Oblivion or Skyrim, my mind is certainly engaged with what I see, but in the back of it, the world is splayed out in front of me as bigger, more detailed. I think about my character walking weeks upon weeks on untraveled lands to reach their destination, even if I choose to fast travel. The game may only offer bears and sabercats as wild animal enemies, but the memory of lore like the snow whales flying above is always there, even if they're not present in the game. When I'm in a city, I always have somewhere in my mind that what is in front of me is a papier-mâché representation of the grandiose nature of Tamriel, and I think that is true for all of the RPGs I play. If I play Dragon Age Origins, just because the edges of the map are obvious enough to feel like corridors, doesn't mean I see it that way in my mind's eye. Thedas is far bigger than that to me, and even though I camp in the game in the same position throughout, that isn't the true width of it to me. My imagination takes that implied location and extends it to every environment I travel to. It's a similar experience I have with, say, Final Fantasy X. Realistically, FF10 is a game compiled of a series of not-so-hidden hallways. But the imagery and world building are so powerful that my mind can see what it is in the distance, beyond reach, and build upon that to create a sphere that is large enough to truly make the final moments of the pilgrimage seem as massive a journey as the game presents. This is what I invest in these games, and the best versions of these games reward you for that extra level of immersion. I think this thought process was ingrained in me from my earliest memories in gaming. The two original games I had before anything else were Super Mario Bros. 1 and 3, and of the two, I liked the third the most. One thing that I think was fabulously unique about that game was how it's presented. The intro sets the scene, presenting the game on a stage and implying the borders of the screen are the borders of said stage. And I think that trained my mind very early on to see games as the micro of a macro experience. It also helps that I was poisoned at a young age with the virus known as Theater Kid, which plays into the greater experience as well. The majority of theater you go to have extremely simplistic sets, and while that often is to keep the show cost-effective, it also invites the crowd to have a shared experience where the focus is on the actors, and in the back of your mind, the stage fills with the details based off the mood of the actor and the scenario they find themselves in. This is the same experience I have with a lot of games. I allow the game to wash over me and engage with it enough to fill in the implications of the world's true size. When I was a kid, toiling away with Pokemon on my Game Boy Color, I wasn't just looking at a screen of interesting but limited sprite art and implied landscapes. I wasn't projecting myself into this top-down landscape one for one. I was using it as a vestibule to imagine myself in a larger Pokemon world on an adventure inspired by the imagery. That's also why I care so little about modern Pokemon graphics discourse. That's never been how I played the series, and it's not something I value very highly in the experience. Now, that's not to say we can't or shouldn't be striving for better, nor is it to give Game Freak an easy out in putting in minimal effort. But it is to say that for I and many like me, those factors are negligible for the overall experience. It's the same exact reason why removing random encounters wasn't a high priority request I had for the series. Not because it wasn't a good idea to move on from them, it definitely was, but instead because I understood that was a game design representation of your journey as a whole and the uniqueness of every Pokemon you catch. I've been playing a lot of the original Final Fantasy VII in my spare time, and on this replay, maybe it's just the environment of playing it on a PlayStation on a CRTV, but it's genuinely the most engaged I've ever been with the game, and I think that's because I'm putting the effort into it and letting the game wash over me. FF7 is probably the most visibly aged of the PS1 Final Fantasy games, and maybe the most aged of all of the FF games. The games that came before all had unique sprite work to support and express the characters in the hopes of overcoming the limitations of the systems they were under. This gives the NES and especially the SNES games an overall timeless feel. Meanwhile, the other two PS1 games use the limited systems to the best of their ability to create more lifelike, if limited, character designs that also overcome what they had to work with. FF7 is the middle child, the awkward in-between period from sprite to polygon. And yet, I couldn't have cared about this any less. I have been more immersed in this experience than any other game I've gone back to and played in retro gaming, and I have gone back and played some of my favorite games of all time, of which FF7 would be well outside of. And that's because I have put as much into this game as it has given me. And I think through that process, it has reminded me why I bounced off of the Final Fantasy VII Remake, and allowed me to put into words that feeling that chased me away. Something I firmly believe in is that the way trademark law works in the modern day is wholly antithetical to the history of human storytelling. I believe in protecting an artist and making sure they profit off their creations for the rest of their lives, of course. But we are also a species born on the creation of myths and legends and parables to be shared around the fire. Stories used as common language to be poked and prodded at from one teller to another. We're a species built on creativity, and the idea of said creativity being barred from the sharing is a wholly new idea. Which is why when there's an adaptation with new creators, I'm all for it, whether it be a fanfic writer or a new creative team in a corporation. I am not precious to the idea of what something is. I think my first video proves that. Which made my aversion to the FF7 remake so odd to me. Sure, I had stopped following Final Fantasy by this point because of purely personal preference, but I recognized this was a series without an identity by design from nearly the beginning, so I reconciled that when I fell out of it. I thought for a long time that was why the remake didn't work for me. But I realize now it's because the world had been solidified into reality, and my imagination no longer had a place within this grand city of Midgar and its new, very literal design. This is, of course, silly of me. But it's also a feeling I've had before, usually with movie or television adaptations of books or comics, or sometimes even video games, and I think that comparison to books and comics speaks to the power of imagination in gaming, and I wonder if it's something that's been lost along the way from artistic interpretation of limited systems to high-quality, lifelike graphics. It's not the story beats that drive me away, At least with video games and books, comic movies, that's a story for another day. Hell, even as I say this, the FF7 trilogy has gone out of its way to add a new layer to the game for returning fans, and I'm not precious. I don't worship at the altar of anything. I think making that change is a stroke of brilliance. But it still doesn't bring me back in. The core issue still exists, and the value of the implied world and why I prefer the original version of the game still stands. I think on a personal and fundamental level, I rail against the idea that anything that is polygonal or sprite-related, or even top-down, needs to be redone totally, that its value is lower than high fidelity. And I feel that way because I firmly believe imagination has value and exists as part of gaming even beyond limited graphic games. I often still carry that imagination into mini-games that are otherwise very vibrantly present on screen without it. But we're now decades past the era where games required that imagination of you, so that aspect of gaming that you bring with you is not as necessary as it once was, and I think that's at least part of the reason why remakes are such a huge part of the conversation regarding what should or shouldn't be done with older games. But to me, that simply isn't something of interest. I'd rather see something new be made, even if I don't like it, even if it's not good. I'd prefer it over a safe remake that removes so much of the contextual call and answer imagination of the original. Hell, sometimes a game will come out and be utterly fantastic, one of the best games of the decade, and still be a poor representative of its series. I've been playing a lot of the original Baldur's Gate lately, and Baldur's Gate 3, in a lot of ways, is a letdown when it comes to both its legacy characters and some of the iconic characters of Faerûn they use in general. I will never forgive you for taking a complex character like Zariel and turning her into a capital E evil villain of the week, Larian. Put some goddamn respect on my girl's name. Stupid. But that criticism aside, I have a tremendous respect for them trying something entirely new, and because they did that, they created a smash hit the likes of which we rarely see. And that's also why I'm wildly disinterested in the rumors of a remake of the older Baldur's Gate games, because it would no longer be those original games, but a modern 4K ground-up recreation that loses all of the magic of the older games. It's for that very reason I have no interest in the Knights of the Old Republic remake that apparently is still being made, probably. I've had my experience with that game. I gave it my imagination, and it gave me a wonderful experience in return, and no amount of 4K ray-traced graphics will replace that original experience to me. Ultimately, I think what this comes down to is my utter resistance to and disdain for categorizing a game that is old as outdated. Gaming is the one medium where there is an emphasis on not just remaking something, but also doing so because the older version is no longer up to snuff, as if a piece of art can be created and then disposed of so frivolously. I really don't mean to sound like an old woman yelling at the clouds here, because I don't think this is an inherently old versus young conversation. I'm not here decrying better graphics or the search for them, nor am I telling you every remake ever made was a bad or fraudulent one, because I think at the core of this conversation is a mindset. I think a lot of us know this intrinsically. I think we all recognize that the boundaries of an area in a God of War game are design choices, and that beyond them is a bigger world we see in our minds. I think we recognize that Night City is not Night City at full scale, but a representation of it. I just think this same recognition often does not extend to games that require a little more of you. I think gaming and AAA companies in general have become so focused on updating and upgrading and redoing things that it's created this mindset when delving into things either old or outside the norm artistically that many players immediately think it should be visually more, and sometimes causes modern players to bounce off of it, and that makes me deeply sad. Because there was a time when gaming was a lot like a book or a comic. It was a launch pad for what you made in your mind, something that added to the experience. And now I think we're losing that. And in the end, I think as we're all priced out of modern gaming as a hobby, it may be time to stop waiting with bated breath for that remake, and instead put that imagination into the world of an older game or an indie game. I think it's long past time to break the remaking graphics over all mindset, and give your time and mind to a game. I promise it will reward you in return.
It's getting out of you, give me the window next to you. I'll make a coffee from the notes that you leave around the room. I'll pour for two, then rinse it off me like the shadow of an undiscovered moon from miles away. That's getting closer.